Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette. In today's video, we talk about our 14 best
vintage buys.
Yes, we just thought we'd just try something new, a different format.
If you like it, this kind of more conversational atmosphere, let us know in the comments and we'll do more in this style.
So without further ado, let's head in right to our first item, vintage overcoats. What do you think, Preston?
I think that's a great pick. I think you've got several vintage overcoats in your collection after all.
Absolutely. I think it's like a paletot, I have double-breasted British warms, I have fur coats, and all of them I bought vintage. They were really inexpensive and they're really warm and they get me a lot of compliments.
I've got a couple of vintage overcoats as well, so I would definitely echo that sentiment. I've got two colors. One of them is sort of a camel hair color.
Okay.
The other one is navy.
Are they real vintage pieces?
They are. Yep, I got them both in secondhand shops for a fraction of the price of what you would get for a new overcoat. So they were both really steals, and I like the style of them too, because they're both longer than typical overcoats you would find today.
Yeah, and that keeps you warmer. We just did videos about Montclair jackets and a Canada Goose parka, and the overcoats that reach your knee and are really heavy actually keep me warmer at negative 30-degree weather than a Canada Goose down rated for whatever temperature would. So second item, I'd say vintage watches. However, that comes a bit with a caveat.
Well, I mean, you have to know what you're looking for, and also in terms of making sure that the watch can actually run. Of course, you can get it repaired if you go to a competent watchmaker, but you have to consider several factors when buying a vintage watch.
Very true. And we already did a guide on what to look for when you buy a vintage watch, but I think the number one thing most people underestimate is maintenance. Just having a watch cleaned, costs you $250 at a minimum. If you go to the official Rolex dealer, it's several $100, maybe even over $1,000. So if you buy this watch that is cheap but doesn't run, it may end up costing you a lot just in repairs.
Absolutely, yeah. So next up, the number 3 item is vintage rings and jewelry, and I know that rings are sort of an area of expertise for you. So.
Yes, I mean, I just love them. We did a video about my collection, and if you want to learn more about them, check them out.
Well, of course, you're not going to see me wear rings very often. It's not that I'm against them, it's just not something I've ever really gotten in the habit of doing.
Cufflinks are something that are really great vintage. Have you got any vintage?
Yes, I do. I have several pairs of vintage cufflinks, and I think in terms of cufflinks specifically and just vintage jewelry in general, you can find a lot of it even on eBay is where I've found a lot of stuff people will sell. They've got their grandfather's old jewelry box and they're selling it for just a couple of dollars. So if you know what to look for and the pictures are good that they've provided, you can find all kinds of pieces for really just a couple of dollars. And that's what I've done.
Yeah, what I find is sometimes you just get a lot of crap and out of there is maybe one good pair of cufflinks. Then you just have to purge it. Also, like all of the jewelry I buy for my wife often is vintage jewelry because you just get a lot bigger bang for your buck. So where it's an engagement ring, right, with a story and personality, it's gonna cost you a fraction of what you'd pay at a regular store.
I'll have to keep that in mind.
Next up is china and silverware. Personally, one of my favorite things to buy vintage is formal china. Because first of all, most people don't want to have it anymore. And rather than eating off my plain IKEA plates, I want to have nice china. And it's meanwhile so cheap that you can get like gold-plated edges for the price of an IKEA plate or even less.
Sure, okay. Well, that's good, yeah, because I think having statement pieces like that, not only is it fun to just experiment with that kind of thing, but certainly if you happen to have company and you can actually break out some awesome vintage china that you've got, your company's going to think it's that much more special too.
Well, it's an extension of your style, right? So we got a nice set of 130 pieces Art Deco china for I think $600 or $700. Also, you can get silverware. We got a set, it's called WMF 2500. It's like an Art Deco set.
Sure.
So it goes really well with the plates and the china, but it's just a coherent experience and it looks so much cooler than just a new set from Lennox or whatever.
Right.
And it's also a lot less expensive. And because it was a popular pattern, it's still around.
Yeah, right, which makes it easy to find more pieces and pair them together if you need to. And of course, you don't have to go for those earlier sort of Victorian styles. You can look for other types of china as well. If you want to go for kind of a mid-century modern feel, let's say, stuff like that is out there too.
Absolutely.
All right, the number 5 item on our list is ties. I guess I would say, first of all, that I have acquired a few vintage ties at places like Goodwill over the years, again, for just like $1 or $2, some of them, and they've got, nice micro patterns and things like that. But a lot of my vintage ties actually have just been passed down to me from relatives and from friends, which is, a good way of saying that oftentimes you can get vintage pieces for nothing at all if you know who to talk to.
Yeah, if I would get hand-me-down ties from my relatives and my dad, they would be like ugly 90s patterns. So I don't think that's a good thing. But I've gotten a lot of them at vintage or estate sales. And I use them for inspiration to design our 4mm ties. But often what I do is I just check out their collection, and sometimes every once in a while you have someone who has a lot of bow ties or ties, and chances that they sell are not very high. Maybe they sell a few. So I always check out when's the last day of the sale, and then I go there just before it ends, and I usually score a bargain where you get it like for 50 cents a tie. I just offer them to buy them all, so they're happy because they don't have to purge them and get rid of them,
Right.
and they get money for them, so they're very amenable to negotiations.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, you bring up a good point. If you're just going to get a bunch of hand-me-down ties from somebody, but they've just got a big stash of leather ties or fish ties or ugly stuff that you don't want, you don't need it. But if you know that the person you're getting them from has good taste and you can incorporate them into your wardrobe, go for it.
Yeah, just pay attention. Oftentimes they're stained or they have moth holes. If you go to a vintage store, they charge you $20 for a tie. And sometimes that's not worth it because the thread is coming apart. So definitely make sure to inspect it. Also, tie it, because vintage ties are often a lot shorter, so they may not work for you.
Absolutely. Have to pay attention to your build too. That's important.
The other thing I've bought quite a bit of vintage are vests. Odd vests that are just contrasting with other outfits. Especially in England, I find them a lot. What's your experience?
Yeah, I don't happen to have any vintage vests or waistcoats in my collection as yet, but I think they would certainly be something to look for, especially because you could probably get them resized fairly easily. You don't even have to worry about sleeve length, which is a big plus.
True, yeah, there's just one measurement. It's basically your chest size. And then they have adjusters in the back.
Right.
So you can easily put them on. And no sleeve length. They just have to cover your waistband, basically. And they're just a great way to change the look of your suit or your sport coats. And some people even wear them without a jacket. That's not me.
Right.
But it does work.
So obviously, between the two of us, you're the homeowner here.
Yeah.
And you can look outside of clothing and other garments like that to other vintage items like, for example, maybe furniture?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lot of the furniture that we got is all vintage or semi-vintage, but it's definitely used. And I think when we started out, we just looked around and mid-century modern was super popular, and there were lots of other styles that we liked, more like classic style, right? So we got a nice Chesterfield sofa from Craigslist from Phoenix and had it shipped over here. And at the end, it cost like 15% of what a new sofa would have cost in the area. But that way we got a quality piece of furniture at a fraction of the cost of what a new one would cost.
Right, so not only was it a bargain, but it actually fit better into the style of your home decor anyway. So kind of a win-win.
Absolutely. And I mean, the same is true for rugs. A lot of people now don't like rugs, and you can find some patterns at IKEA or like big box stores, but they're like really cool Persian rugs sometimes for like $300. They help like dampen the sound, keep your room more easy to walk on, like the temperature is more comfortable, and overall they can look good if it's part of your style.
Right.
Unlike with furniture, I think with rugs it really pays to see them in person because the way the light shines on them and the way they lay can have an impact on how they look. So even though it may look great on eBay, it may look shitty in the room. So keep that in mind.
Right. So continuing on with that interior decor thing, is there any other vintage items you've picked up as well?
Yeah, totally. Like paintings, lightings, chandeliers. I really like vintage chandeliers. So that makes a huge difference. and the quality you get. It's sometimes gilded bronze, and they sell for a few $100s versus a cheap light from Home Depot.
Right.
Will cost you the same, but it's made of a composite material that will just age very poorly versus this will stand the test of time.
Right. I'm not yet a homeowner, but as I get into that market probably within the next year or two here, I think I'll definitely consider looking into some vintage pieces because, again, you can find stuff in all kinds of different styles and the quality of those older items can't be beat.
Yeah, so you have to watch more videos so we make more money and can pay Preston a higher salary so he can buy a home. So if you are into vintage at all, the best place to buy those things, in my experience, is a flea market called Brimfield. It is ginormous. There are hundreds of vendors. I went there with my wife for a whole week, and you go every day, and we still didn't cover the entire market. And you can find anything there. You can find super cheap stuff, super expensive stuff, very unique stuff, clothes. I bought a lot of rings there, some tweed jackets, and it's just overall a fantastic experience if you like that kind of stuff.
Right. And where is Brimfield located?
I think it's in Massachusetts. It's like 2 hours or so outside of Boston. It's really in a rural area, so you have to kind of stay at an Airbnb or somewhere. Yeah, just type in Brimfield into Google and it'll pop up.
Sounds like it's worth the trip.
It's fun for sure. Actually, last time we bought so much, we have to ship home a bunch of boxes. So they have UPS and everything right there, so you can ship it from there.
Oh, good.
Or just save a few bucks and go to the local post office.
Okay.
It works.
Great. All right, here's our number 11 item, and this is a big one for me. Except for my straw boater, which you've seen in a couple of videos, all of my vintage fedoras and trilbies are just that. They're vintage hats. Most of them, I think, are from the late 50s or the early 60s.
Nice. Yeah, I can vouch for Preston. He shows up in a hat, in a fedora, or a boater every day to work.
And the great thing about these hats, well, for one thing, it's easy for me to shop for vintage hats because I've got a relatively small head, and when you're looking at vintage hats, those smaller sizes, I think, are the ones that are more commonly available.
What's your hat size?
My hat size is right around a 7. Sometimes it'll be a 6 and 7/8, sometimes it'll be a 7 1/8.
So if you're in Europe, that means about hat size 56. I'm like 4 sizes larger. I'm a 60 or like 7 3/8, 7 1/2.
Sure.
It's more difficult to find hats in that size, but it's still possible. I have like 20 vintage hats, and I just acquired them from eBay, flea markets, and so forth.
Right. And of course, given that most of my vintage hats date to late 50s, early 60s, most of them have fairly narrow brims. I love the look of those more 1940s style hats with the wide brims like you would see somebody like Humphrey Bogart wear, but I just don't think that they fit my specific face shape quite as well, is what I happen to have found.
Yeah, and if you want to check out the video on what kind of type of hat you should wear for your build and face shape, please check out this video here. The other thing I really like about vintage hats is the quality of the felt, and they had a lot more colors. And also the headbands, they just have interesting colors. And there's a hatter in town who has like a box of vintage headbands. So sometimes just changing the headband to a vintage one has this really cool color depth, and it changes the look of your hat entirely. And the other thing to consider is most of them have like these leather sweatbands inside.
Yep.
And sometimes they're kind of crackling.
They can be, yeah.
Yeah, so you can always exchange them and put in new ones. I usually go with like fabric ones when I put in new ones because I'm prone to getting zits when I wear a lot of hats. So the fabric sweatband helps to reduce that. So I mean, for hats, if you want that 1930s fedora style, on eBay they can be really pricey because that's super popular. Other hats, on the other hand, are a lot less, right?
Absolutely. I got some of my vintage hats. In fact, the one that I wear most often, I think I picked it up for, honestly, about $12.50 was the final price that I paid for it. And
Nice.
It's in great condition. Another one that I picked up, it has a few minor moth marks on the underside of the brim, but, you know,
That
very
happens
few
sometimes.
people are going to see that anyway. So also, just so long as, again, you can pay attention to the pictures if you're shopping online, or just doing a thorough check if it's in person, make sure that it's in good condition, and you'll get a lot of use out of it. I mean, I have reblocked my vintage hats myself. I watched a few videos on how to do it. I did it at home with my tea kettle. It was super easy, and now they all have exactly the look that I want, which is great.
Sounds like a person is going to make another video about hat blocking soon. One more thing about hats, you can only buy them remotely or online if you buy a softer felt hat, like a fedora. If you go with a bowler hat or a top hat, you have to try them on because they're in a stiff shape. So if the hat is size 60 or 7.5, and that's what you usually have, it may still not fit, and you get a really bad headache if you wear them because they just push on your brain.
Right. So we already talked about conventional long neckties, but we should mention too that I also happen to have a couple of vintage bow ties in my collection and some vintage pocket squares as well.
Yeah, I once went to an estate sale here in Minneapolis, and the gentleman was a trial lawyer, and he always wore bow ties. And they were nice, things from like Paul Stewart or printed in England. And he just had this rich collection, and of course, people are not that keen on bow ties.
Right.
I mean, more so now than 10 years ago. But, they maybe sold 10 or so, and I bought the remaining 90. And that worked out quite well for me.
Right.
One thing I have not had much luck with are pocket squares for some reason. There's often not that many, and then they're in bad shape. What do you think?
Well, I've just gotten lucky. I only have about 2 or 3 vintage pocket squares.
Okay.
I got them from a little menswear shop that's local to the area. So I guess that's another good tip. If you go to Google Maps or just look elsewhere, even word of mouth, find some of those little hole-in-the-wall establishments that you might not normally look for, and they might have some great finds, especially if they've got something like a bargain basement.
Totally. Or if you travel maybe and you have a few hours to kill, maybe check for vintage stores. Sometimes they're really cool ones, and it's just an experience to go there.
All right, so another thing I should mention here. Recently, I was in the market for a dark brown suit that I wanted to wear for an event. And you can probably vouch for this. Dark brown isn't a super popular color, at least not currently, for suits that are being sold.
It isn't. I mean, we did this one piece about the charcoal brown suit, which is kind of a dark brown, so that's what you were going for.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
But because I couldn't find anything like that in any, big retailers that are currently sold, I decided to see what I could find on eBay. And I happened to find one that was in my size, a 38 regular jacket and 30-32 trousers. Does it fit perfectly right now? No, but that's because I haven't taken any additional time to get alterations done.
But I mean, no suit off the rack fits perfectly. And oftentimes a vintage suit has the advantage of a heavier fabric that just drapes better, more naturally. So even if it doesn't fit 100%, it looks very neat.
Right, and some of the stylistic details of this particular suit were pretty cool too. It's a ventless jacket, for instance, so I really like how it, flatters my form and hugs my silhouette.
Something they did in the 30s a lot because they just felt that it looked better. Even though when you stand with your hands in a pocket, it's not ideal, I think.
Right, yep.
So what was the event you wanted that suit for?
This was actually a concert put on at my alma mater, Gustavus Adolphus College, sort of a Christmas concert thing. And, when you go back to a place you haven't been in a while, you want to make sure that you look good. So I decided to do it that way.
Okay, cool. I've also found that you find really interesting and unique fabrics and details in vintage suits, and just the way the gorge is set and the lapel is set. Sometimes it's very specific 30s silhouette or like a 60s silhouette. And if you want that, and if you want to incorporate it into your wardrobe, it's just cool. But it's particularly good for people who like hard-wearing suits out of a thicker fabric, because back then they didn't have the super thin and flimsy ones. So you want that, vintage suits are probably not for you.
Right. Also, on a related note, I picked up a vintage blazer at Goodwill for just about $10. This was, I think, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. And you've seen me wear this blazer in several videos already. I've gotten a couple of comments on it from commenters and compliments from people in person. So it's one of my favorite pieces in my wardrobe. It only cost me $10, and I think it looks pretty good.
Awesome. One thing we both like a lot in vintage is evening wear, because back in the day, people had more use for those garments, so you see a greater variety in details. You see tuxedos in midnight blue with a herringbone fabric, or an off-white dinner jacket.
Absolutely, yeah. I have a couple of black tie ensembles that I'll wear in sort of my side gig, if you will, as a jazz singer. With classic jazz, that kind of environment almost requires a tuxedo.
Totally.
And I have
he even has a vintage microphone, so it's
I do,
it
yes.
goes beyond just the clothing.
So one of my black tie ensembles is more modern, but one, which I also found on eBay, is a vintage ensemble. I think it dates to about the mid-1950s. It's got really wide grosgrain lapels, it's double-breasted, it's midnight blue. You'll actually see it in some videos that will be coming out around this time. But I liked the look of that vintage piece, and then I was able to have it tailored so it fit me even better as well.
Nice. Yeah, I think I have 2 complete tuxedos, a tailcoat, a morning coat, which is not a tuxedo, but it's formal wear, and a dinner jacket, just all vintage.
And now the most important question for each one of our videos, what are you wearing today?
Well, of course, all vintage. It's a vintage tweed jacket that I got in Boston, I think. It was about $15. The shirt is kind of vintage. I got that when I was studying, is a vintage shirt from Siniscalchi in Milan. Yeah, my trousers are vintage, got them for $5. They have this kind of tweedy effect. It's like gray with blue and brown, so they combine very well. And then for my shoes, they're not vintage, they're just some penny loafers in dark brown. My pocket square is like a vintage Brioni that I found very early on in my style journey. I like the pattern. It's like a brown paisley, although it's very small, so it sometimes disappears in the pocket. That's why with our own pocket squares from Fort Belvedere, I made sure that the right size, so they always stay in a perfect spot. The tie is a vintage tie. I like the look of it. It has these kind of brown tones and the navy, which works well with the ensemble.
Absolutely.
What about you? I put you on the spot here.
Right, a little bit
to film
of...
this video, so you probably don't have all vintage today simply because I put you on a spot.
Right, a little bit of behind the scenes there. We filmed this video sort of impromptu, so I'm not wearing a lot of vintage pieces today, but I do happen to be wearing one. It's an old vintage necktie, and it's not the one you see here, which is actually a tie from Fort Belvedere, but it's the one that I'm wearing underneath my sweater as a belt. This is a point that we covered recently in our video on 11 bad men's style rules that we think you can ignore. We think that it's perfectly acceptable to wear an old tie as a belt if it isn't really suitable to be worn as a tie anymore.
Yeah, Fred Astaire would do that, and maybe Preston is going to do a video about all the do's and don'ts, the length of the tie, and what to do and what not.
Well, we'll see if it gets in the works, but that's the vintage piece in my wardrobe today.